1. Green Goblin / Norman Osborn. In my opinion, he was the most iconic character in comic book history. In this video we're going to talk about the original comic book stories of the villains who have faced off against every Spider-Man there's ever been, and together we'll see that they actually have much deeper characters and a much bigger world than the movies show. Our first character is Green Goblin. We first saw him back in 1964, in issue number 14, so we're talking about a pretty old character. His story is quite deep. According to the original story, Norman Osborn is a smart but greedy businessman at the head of his own company, and he decides to develop an experimental enhancement formula for military use. But while the formula is still in the testing phase, Norman can't help himself and decides to test it on himself alone, because the character in the comics is very impatient and wants to reach greatness and more money as soon as possible. And then something happens that occurs in almost every fictional comic book: a lab accident. The formula being produced explodes, and all the pieces coming out of it hit Norman Osborn almost everywhere. And of course, that has a consequence. Our character reaches an incredible level of physical strength. Of course, there's a downside to this. As physically powerful as he became, his mental state became just as unbalanced. Actually, I want to point out something a lot of people don't understand. After this accident, Norman starts living with a split personality inside himself. He wrestles both with himself and with the persona inside him called the Goblin. I think this was handled very well in the movies. In fact, if you've watched Lord of the Rings, you may have seen this same split personality trait in Gollum. It's practically identical. Having started living with two personalities inside him, Norman wanted money, power, and status before the accident, but after the accident these desires become even more obsessive and strange. And over many years in the comics, we see his struggle with Spider-Man. Honestly, I think Tobey's movies handled the Green Goblin character in a way that came very close to the comics, and I don't really have anything to criticize there. What do you all think? Let's move on to the next villain's original comic book story. 2. Dr. Octopus, Otto Octavius. He's definitely one of the most charismatic villains in the Spider-Man movies. In fact, the Spider-Man films handled Dr. Octopus so well that something that normally never happened. Even the comics fell behind. Of course, this is just my personal opinion. I'd love it if you shared your thoughts too. Anyway, friends, when we look at his original comic book story, Otto has been a bookworm since childhood, socially excluded, and raised in the shadow of an overly protective mother, a genius. For some reason, almost every villain in the comics is a genius. I find that a bit cliched now. What do you think? Anyway, after becoming a scientist, Otto works on nuclear research and develops a special, mind-controlled suit with 4 mechanical arms. And of course, the classic happens: a lab accident occurs. The radiation leak released in this lab accident fuses the mechanical arms to his spine, and these mechanical arms literally become a part of him. And of course, as in other stories, it also affects his brain, turning him into a more aggressive character fueled by a hunger for control. If you don't understand why the mental ambition, anger, and evil of these villains increase so much after lab accidents, let me give you a simple example. If you recall, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, before Captain America, the Red Skull used the super soldier serum, and of course it turned him into an even worse person. That's why the formula's creator was looking for someone who was fundamentally a good person, which is why he chose Steve Rogers, even though his body was thin, weak, frail, and he even had illnesses. So this is the foundation of comic book storytelling. Whatever emotion is inside you, it gets amplified to a higher level as a result of an accident or a substance taken from outside. If you followed along this far, let's continue. After this lab accident, Otto and Spider-Man clash many times in the comics. By the way, I can't move on without mentioning this. In the comics, Otto has a bald head-style hairstyle, and visually he looks quite funny and cute, but Tobey's film version really has a great look, and since it goes so far beyond the comics, I have to give it credit. What do you think? Do you find the movie version of Otto more charismatic, or the comic book version? Write your thoughts. 3. Venom / Eddie Brock. We've praised Tobey's Spider-Man movies a lot. Let's move on to a character where we're going to start talking about flaws. Venom is definitely a wasted character, because his story in the comics is much more extensive and deep. In the first story where he appears, Peter Parker finds a black costume on an alien planet and starts wearing it. It takes him quite a while to realize that this costume is actually a living, thinking creature. This living organism of a costume amplifies Peter Parker's emotions, especially his negative emotions like anger. Actually, when you look at it, both visually and story-wise, it's a really nice and enjoyable topic, but for some reason, when they brought it to the movies, they showed it very briefly, and it felt like a story that was thrown together and wrapped up in a hurry. I, for one, would have loved to see Venom together with Tom in an MCU classic. I think a masterpiece like that could earn MCU millions of dollars, because a fan like me is waiting for Venom's arrival. Do you think I'm right on this point, or am I being unfair to Tobey? 4. Sandman, Flint Marko. The comic book story is actually quite similar. Flint Marko, who has been involved in bad events since a young age, takes shelter on a beach near a nuclear test site during an escape, and right at that moment a nuclear test occurs. As the radiation and sand transform his entire body, small particles separate from him, and he literally turns into sand. And this way, he becomes a character who can take on any shape he wants. In terms of motivation, compared to other characters, he doesn't have a very deep backstory. He's got the classic let's get rich the easy way storyline. But over time, as he became a beloved character in the comics, later writers added a deeper layer to him. They started writing him as a character who needs money for medical expenses to treat his sick daughter, which was an attempt to make him more sympathetic, or at least that's what I thought. Honestly, his story still isn't very deep, but visually, when they translated him from comics to film, we watched a legendary sequence in Tobey's trilogy. I think we were very lucky to see scenes reflected so well and feel so realistic for the technology of that era, because even with today's technological capabilities, they still cut down Hulk's screen time a lot or don't show his transformations, but for the technology of that time, Sandman was really shown incredibly well. Still, when you dig deeper, I don't think he's a character with very strong motivation. 5. The Lizard. Dr. Curt Connors. Comics really love turning characters into an animal, or loading that animal's traits onto a character. This is exactly one of those, but I think it's a fairly classic story. Connors, unfortunately, is someone who has lost an arm. Afterward, inspired by observations of reptiles' ability to regenerate their limbs, he decides to develop a formula that could allow humans to regrow their own lost limbs too. And of course, he decides to test it on himself. At first, everything goes well because his arm actually grows back. But, as I said before, all these formulas achieve what they want but always have a side effect, and now our character turns into an uncontrollable, dangerous reptile-human hybrid. I'm really curious what you think about this. Since the start of the video, we've seen that the transformation of almost every character happens through a lab accident, and many of them are scientists. Do you think this has become a cliché that's making things boring now, or do you think that's just how comics are, and you're someone who loves that about them? I'd love to hear your thoughts. 6. Vulture/Adrian Toomes. Actually, his story is quite different from what we see in the movies. In the comics, Toomes is an electrical engineer. Unfortunately, he's betrayed by a coworker, and to take revenge for this betrayal and reclaim what was taken from him, he uses a flight technology he developed himself. This flight technology resembles a wing system, and thanks to this system, he's able to increase his strength and energy. Honestly, the comic book look is a bit more comical and not nearly as cool since they made this character better and gave his story more depth. Credit has to be given to the Marvel Cinematic Universe here. I have to hand it to them. I think they did a good job. So, do you agree with me? Do you think the comic book version or the MCU version is cooler? 7. Mysterio, Quentin Beck. A character with an almost identical story in the comics. Beck is actually a Hollywood special effects expert, and thanks to his filmmaking skills, he develops an illusion, including fog machines and hologram technology, creating an atmosphere that feels almost magical and real. Actually, compared to what we see in the MCU, we could say the comic book version comes across as a bit more amateurish. In the comics, Beck is unsatisfied with the film industry, wants to become famous and recognized, and is a character who plans to eat Spider-Man in order to somehow gain money and fame this way. Actually, when you look at it, there's no lab accident here, there's no incredibly genius guy character, and there's no character undergoing a transformation either. We could call this a street-level character, and I really love characters like this. I think the MCU deepened the comic book story even further and handled it much better. Do you agree with me? I'm curious to know. I made this video covering the Spider-Man villains we've seen in the movies, whose comic book versions are actually very different. If you want a part 2 of this video, please let me know in the comments. Also, write in the comments whether you think the comic book versions or the movie versions are better, and don't forget to mention your favorite Spider-Man villain. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. See you in the next video. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe, because next week we'll be talking about the villains of the Venom universe and the true comic book origins of the Sinister Six. See you in the next video.